Yep. Okay, good evening, everybody. Thank you for being here. I wanted to start by thanking the Community Center for hosting us and for being very generous with their time, helping us set up. And then thank you to all the folks from CDA who helped us set up tonight. We're here today to talk about just cause for evictions, a policy that's going to be before the board next week. But before we get started, I want to go through some of our handouts because we have a lot of them, which we're really excited about. We want to make sure that you get them all. So we have a copy of the staff report for the September 11th staff report. And if you have a copy of that, I'm going to reference some of the information that's in that by page number, so there's more detail in that than some of the stuff that I'll go over. There's a copy of the PowerPoint if you want to take notes on it. And then we also have a copy of the work plan from 2015 that the board adopted. And we have on your chairs, there's a place where you can write a comment letter to the board about Just Cause. And then if you have questions for us, there's the yellow one. And we have an FAQ, frequently asked questions, that is the yellow sheet, also there. So we have lots of information for you. So before we get started, I wanted to go over some background information, and this is pages 4 through 6 in your staff report. Just to give you a little bit of background about why we're having a conversation about just cause for evictions right now. So going back to 2015, and I'm sorry, I'm going to stop for a second because I didn't introduce myself or some of the staff who are working here. I think I might know everybody here, but just in case I don't. I'm Lily Thomas, and I work for the Community Development Agency. Also here is Debbie LaRue, who works with me in the Community Development Agency. Aline works with me, Marilee, and Anna Hilda, have all come here to help us out tonight. So in 2015, the Community Development Agency did a survey of rental housing in the county to get a picture of what was going on in the rental housing market. And we got about 1,000 responses, mostly from renters, but there was also some from homeowners and landlords. And what we heard was not surprising, but it was still disturbing, that most of the tenants who responded were concerned about steep rent increases, about evictions, and about displacement. And so, in response to that, partially in response to that, the board adopted a work plan that was intended to address preserving affordability in our rental housing market and preventing displacement. And there was a whole laundry list of things on that work plan. And they have gotten through most of the things on that work plan. And I'm going to go over some of them, but again, this is in your staff report. Some of this information is in your staff report, pages 4 through 6. And so to start out with, we worked on a landlord partnership program, and that was intended to increase access to housing for folks who had a Section 8 voucher by providing some incentives to landlords and just kind of streamlining that process. That program was available throughout the county, both in the unincorporated and in the cities and towns. The real community rentals.
What kind could you elaborate just a little bit? What kind of incentives?
So there was security deposits offered for tenants. There was also some vacancy protection. So if a landlord was renting to a Section 8 tenant and their apartment was empty for 2 months before they rented to another Section 8 tenant, then they could cover a portion of that rent. And then there was also some funds for damages. If there was damages done to a unit that exceeded the security deposit, then there was funds to help with that. because those were the concerns that people heard about why they were not taking Section 8. They found actually through the program that most of the money went to security deposits because people were in fact not damaging the units or leaving them vacant for long periods of time. So most of the money was used for security deposits. The Real Community Rentals program was funded by the county to help folks in West Marin to hopefully get folks to rent out to long-term tenants rather than use their rentals as short-term rentals, and to increase the number of rentals that were available in people's homes. Again, just in the West Marin part of the county. The source of income protection also addressed Section 8 tenants and provided an ordinance that prevents landlords from advertising no Section 8. You used to be that in the unincorporated part of the county, you could look at Craigslist and it would say no dogs, no smoking, no Section 8. And now it's in the unincorporated part of the county, you're required to consider somebody with Section 8 voucher on the same equal footing as you would somebody without a Section 8 voucher. Both Fairfax and Novato have passed similar ordinances. So in any of those three jurisdictions, it's kind of increased the access for folks with Section 8. And then the board passed late last year, it went into effect early this year, a program that requires mandatory mediation if a tenant or landlord requests it. If there's a rent increase that exceeds 5%, that's 5% or greater, then a tenant or landlord can ask for mediation. And there's no binding requirement that comes out of that mediation. People are not prevented from increasing their rents beyond that 5%, but it's just a place where both sides can kind of share the impacts that they've had from that rent increase or why they need that rent increase. So in addition to all of those other items, Just Cause for evictions has been on the board's work plan since 2015. In fact, they discussed it about 6 times, and most recently on June 12th of this year, as part of our ongoing assessment of fair housing. There was a recommendation made by a couple of community groups to consider a just cause for eviction ordinance as a way of addressing one of the impediments to fair housing. And that recommendation was that the board look at a just cause for eviction ordinance before the end of the year. And so in response to those recommendations, the board has scheduled a workshop for the 11th of September at 5:30. So next Tuesday at 5:30. And at that workshop, the board is going to be asked to either to delve in a little bit deeper into a just cause for eviction ordinance, and then to either move forward with an ordinance or take it off the work plan. And so what we hope to do tonight was to answer questions that you have after I go through my presentation, and so that you can be more informed to participate in that workshop. And we're also repeating this workshop tomorrow night in Marin City, same time at the base at Martin Luther King Jr. Middle School. So if anybody wasn't able to come that might be interested, or if you really like listening to us talk about this, and you want to hear it again, then you're welcome to come tomorrow night. So before we talk about the kind of the nuts and bolts about a just cause eviction ordinance, I think it's important to understand what is renting in Marin like. And if you're a renter, then I probably don't need to tell you this, but many people are not. And so I think it would be helpful for us to go through some of the statistics about the rental market in Marin. And starting with looking at our vacancy rate. We've had a just cause for eviction things around the state, and as the vacancy rate has gotten a lot tighter in the Bay Area, more and more communities have adopted just cause for eviction policies around the Bay Area. And if we look at Marin, you can see that we have some of the lowest vacancy rates in both the homeowner vacancy rate and among the rental vacancy rate. And so for what's the significance for homeowner vacancy rate, if you are a renter who's interested in moving to homeownership and you could afford to, there isn't a lot of choice for you to do that. So even if you can afford to, there's a vacancy rate that's less than 1% among homes. So if you want to buy a home and you're a renter, that further impacts the rental market because you're not able to move out of it. And if you're a renter, we have a vacancy rate of less than 3%, which means that you don't have a lot of choice. And if there's an unexpected move, then you're severely impacted by that. And in addition to those low vacancy rates, a lot of our homes, instead of being used for long-term rentals, are being used for short-term rentals. And that's especially true in the west part of the county. So that's further impacted the low vacancy rates. In addition to our tight vacancy rate, we have some of the highest median housing costs in the country, in the Bay Area and in Marin. And when you look at what it costs to live here compared to what the average renter can actually pay, you should have about $90,000 a year to afford the average rent in Marin. And in fact, most renters in Marin, the median income of a renter in Marin is about $60,000. And so what that does is it means a lot of folks are living in overcrowded situations, or they are have a high rent burden. In fact, we have over 19,000 people who are renters and are rent burdened. And what that means is that they're paying more than 30% of their income for rent, and so they don't have enough funds left over for some other basic necessities. And in addition, because rents are so high, when you want to move in somewhere, security deposits are also high. So you need about $5,000. Sometimes rents or security deposits are about $5,000 for a security deposit. And recently in the news, many of you may have heard that most Americans found that they don't have $400 available for an emergency. And yet a renter who's living in Marin and has an unexpected move needs to come up with up to $5,000 for security deposit. So that's just another impact to think about when you're thinking about whether the impacts of having a just cause for eviction policy. I'm going to get to your questions in just a minute, unless it's something to clarify some data on here. I'll come back to you. So when we talk about what is an eviction, sometimes you think an eviction, it's an unlawful detainer. You have to check the box when you're renting of whether you've ever been evicted. And our definition of evicted is more in line with Matthew Desmond's definition. He wrote the book Evicted. If you're a housing nerd and really like to get into this, I'd recommend it to you. But he has said that it is when a renter is displaced from their housing, that they don't want to move, and the landlord requires them to move, that's an eviction. And what just cause policies do is that they ask that a landlord be required to say what the reason is that they're being asked to leave. Simple as that. That's the basic premise of them. And as I mentioned earlier, they're a tool that's being used more frequently to address displacement in our communities as we have really tight rental markets. Some of the concerns that we've heard around just cause are that just cause is rent control. And so that's a concern that we've heard from our landlords. And if it's not rent control, then it will lead to rent control. And so I think we need to be very clear that just cause does not address rapidly rising rents. It does not impact whether a landlord can increase their rents. And so if you're concerned about rent increases, just cause alone is not going to address that. Some of the other concerns that we've heard are that it's going to increase the cost of an eviction. One of the things that we've been looking at is maybe a just cause for eviction policy will actually provide more clarity and more transparency for both parties if you're ending a lease termination. So if you have to be really clear about what the reason is, then maybe it'll be clear for both parties, especially for some smaller landlords who don't necessarily have a good written lease agreement. So usually, in a just cause for eviction ordinance, the reasons for eviction are divided into two categories. And one of them is for cause, and the other is a no fault. And these are on page 7, I believe, of your staff report. There's a whole detailed list of all of them.
Page 5, I think.
Page 5, thank you. So, for cause reasons are typically you're not paying your rent, you're engaged in illegal activity, you're a nuisance to your neighbors, you're causing undue noise, other kind of clear lease violations. And then no fault, or usually when an owner is going to move into the apartment or into the home, if there's major rehabilitation that needs to be done, and there's permits that are filed, etc., or if you're going to remove the home from the rental market. That's under California law, you have to be required to remove your home from the rental market. And there are just cause policies around the whole state, starting in 1980, I believe is the earliest one. This is a list of them. That are some that have rent control or rent stabilization as part of them, and a number of them do not. There's several examples of recent ones, Emeryville and Union City, which we have looked at as models when we were looking at it. They're most recently adopted, and they don't have the rent stabilization, but they do have the just cause eviction. If the board does decide to move forward with a just cause for eviction ordinance, there's a couple of areas that we'll be asking them to look into. The first would be applicability. Who would this apply to? One option is that it would be like the source of income, that it applies to every rental in the county. There's other options where you could apply it to a subset. And again, it would just be the unincorporated part of the county. Sometimes owner-occupied units are exempt from it, like a share rental or an accessory dwelling unit. Sometimes they only apply to multifamily housing, and so the board would be looking at those different, that would be a decision point. Also, data collection is something that we've been kicking around for a long time and is often included in the just cause ordinance. So if the board opted to, they could include information about all evictions and ask the county get a copy of that. Also about rent increases. They could track rent increases if they wanted to get some real-time data about that. And then whether or not to include relocation assistance and the right of first return. And what that means, relocation assistance is some just cause for eviction ordinances have relocation assistance. For example, if an owner is moving in, or if they're taking their rental out of the rental market, that they be required to pay for relocation for that tenant. And then often the right of first return is when, if a home is going to be renovated, that tenant be allowed to move back into that unit afterwards. And then finally, kind of how enforcement is done is another thing that they would need to consider if the board decides to move forward with the just cause for eviction ordinance. What we have recommended in our staff report is that we model it after the source of income and just use that same method, which basically puts it that there would be no active enforcement, but that the tenant would have the option of pursuing pursuing enforcement through the courts if they felt like it had been violated. Because we didn't have, otherwise we need to set up a significant infrastructure, a rent board, etc. So our recommendation is going to go to the board. Again, it's on Tuesday, and if you would like to provide comments, there's a variety of ways to do that. You can go to the board meeting. You can submit on this piece of white paper here as comments, or you can just send an email to bos@waynecounty.org. And then we are happy to answer any questions that you may have. Jean, did you have a question? Or you can write your question down if you prefer.
A couple of things. What is your deadline for comments? Did you mention that?
The deadline for comments.
Oh, the board receives comment right up until the board meeting. I would recommend that you try to get your comments in by noon at the latest on Tuesday, just to make sure that the supervisors do have time to review them even for a couple minutes before the hearing.
Okay. I represent the San Jerome Valley Planning Group at this meeting, and we've been on vacation 2 months, but we've been emailing our thoughts about this. And we're going to be going over that information plus my notes to send a recommendation. Generally speaking, I would say we're very much in support. And I'd like you to know that our community plan that was adopted 20 years ago talked about a major goal being encouraging social and economic diversity, in the valley, and that we did that by giving good quality housing that's affordable to people who are low income. We feel those are critical. And then with what's going on today, it's a little bit crazy. So how you do that is quite going to be a problem. The reason I raised my hand, and I'm sorry for interrupting you because you really wanted to finish your presentation, but I was wondering, those of us who live in the valley and West Marin are in 2 separate corridors than the eastern urbanized corridor, which has about 90% of the residents. My question is, do your statistics reflect any differences, or are we just in West Marin lumped in with all the good folks in the eastern urbanized corridor?
These are countywide, this is countywide information, it's not specifically broken out. But from my experience, there's probably fewer renters in West Marin than in the more urbanized part of the county. But people are facing, as I mentioned earlier, just as much, same barriers and the same issues that are faced by the other folks. And maybe even more impacted by the fact of the short-term rental issues and, transportation, access, etc. So I would say that although they're not specifically broken out by for West Marin, that the challenges that folks are facing are similar.
Yeah, I wanted to just say that I was looking at some census data from the American Community Surveys that the Census Bureau puts out, which has data by census tract and by community. And the data show that, first of all, earnings of people in the valley are less, considerably less than they are. Income is less. And rentals are a little bit less. But incrementally, there's a big difference between what people earn living here and what the rentals are. So even though our family income is less than countywide, our rentals are much more connected to what the countywide rental prices are. And housing prices, as you know, have gone up for home buyers as well. So I'll be happy to send you some of that information that I got from the census if you're interested.
I'm aware of some of that, Suzanne. Thank you very much for that. But part of the thing that is not included is a clear understanding of the illegal as well as legal units we have in the San Geronimo Valley and what those rent for. I don't think there's a lot of evidence about what impact that might have. So there's things still to learn, I think, that we need to know before we can say certain things or know in which direction to move. It's an ongoing process, and what you've done here is wonderful and quite remarkable. And I'm very glad that the Affordable Housing Group in the Valley is now vigorously moving ahead with good information and good leadership. We haven't had that in the past. It's been spotty in the past. But we've got a long way to go.
Thank you, Chief. Thank you. Is anybody else? Thanks for that information too, Suzanne. Vicki?
Could you speak a little bit more, please, Lily, about the relocation assistance? Is that required if a tenant is not under lease? In other words, after the first year of the lease has expired and it's an ongoing month to month?
So different jurisdictions deal with relocation in different ways. One community requires relocation only if the tenant has lived there for 2 years or more. So it really can be tailored in different ways. I've seen, there's some communities where they only apply it, there's an income, it's based on the income of the tenant. And so if the person is lower income, then they're required to, or disabled, they're required to pay relocation assistance. And some just cause for eviction ordinances don't have any relocation assistance as part of them. So they can be done in a variety of ways.
Are there any aspects of the different options that you presented tonight that you think will be most beneficial in Marin, and any that are such a heavy lift that we might want to wait a little bit on them?
Well, I mean, I think that people are going to have to think about their own sense of what what's most important to them. I think that the relocation assistance is probably the hardest thing. You know, I've heard, as we've talked to landlords and property owners, that is a difficult thing, especially for smaller landlords that, to come up with significant relocation assistance, so that can be costly, especially with how much it costs to move and security deposits here.
And can I ask one more
Sure.
question? In terms of Section 8 renters, and if that renter might be in an ADU or a JDU, would this also apply?
That depends on if the board moved forward with a just cause for eviction, that is one of the things that they'd have to consider, is how broad the applicability would be. Would it apply if there was an owner occupant on the property? Would it apply for an ADU or a JDU, or would it apply to single family homes? So that's one thing that would have to be considered.
Yeah, I think in our community, which is mostly, single dwellings and one could be a JDU or an auxiliary unit of another kind, that's critical. Because if it only applies to multi-family dwellings, it's not going to really have any impact on the valley, because we don't have, big developments.
And Debbie or Aline, do either of you know the percentage of renters in Marin that live in single family compared to multifamily?
Compared to multifamily?
Yeah.
I do not.
Yeah, we don't know. We can get that to you if you're interested. Go
I
ahead.
have a question, not about just cause. I think it's wonderful that there is a division of the county that I could look at that's explaining, that is looking at just cause. Is there also a county, section that is looking at rent increases? Like you hear about what happens in the canal all the time. Is that also something the county is working to address?
So the mandatory mediation program that the board adopted is intended to look at those. It doesn't prevent them, but is intended to, if there's dramatic rent increases like the ones that you've read about, we've all read about recently in the canal, where there was a 40% rent increase, that there be a place where a landlord and a tenant could sit down and have a conversation. And I think that there's 12 people that have taken advantage of it to date since it went into effect in January. And so that is, rent stabilization or rent control was one of the options that was on the board's original work plan, and they took that off at the beginning, so that is something that is not on the table. But the mediation is something that is intended to do that. Also, the board is looking at some issues with code enforcement and making sure that our housing inspection process and code enforcement are enhanced, so that if there's livability issues with homes, that those are addressed more frequently and that inspections are done more regularly. I think there was here and then there, and
Yeah, I was just wondering in other jurisdictions and how it might work here. What about the enforcement piece, and how would it work? I mean, what if somebody says, well, you can't live here anymore because my son is coming home and he wants to live in the second unit, and the son comes home and he stays there for a month, and then he's gone, and then the tenant already had to move, right? And come up with security deposits and buy another place to live. How do we solve that?
right, so there's, they're done in a variety of ways. Again, I keep saying that, but sometimes, you know, options are that it is basically, has to be self-enforced through by the tenant, seeking, you know, going to legal aid, for example, and seeking assistance that way. There's other ones where there's a rent board and there's more oversight. That's typically done in communities where there is also rent control. And so usually, I believe, the examples that we've looked at, that it's usually done where the tenant has to seek the enforcement. You want to add something?
There are also a couple jurisdictions who look at addressing this through a data collection provision. So generally, what data collection does is it says that when you're renting a unit, a landlord is required to let the county know that you're renting it. So you rent to a new tenant, you give them a notice of their rights, you enter a new lease, you let the county know that you're now renting your unit, and you're required to do that to be able to increase rent or evict somebody at the end. So it's really like the landlord has to register their unit if they're going to be able to exercise their rights as a landlord. And that way we would find out if somebody, you know, if their lease was terminated, the landlord checked a box and says, you know, owner move in. Immediate family member would be considered the owner moving in. And then 2 months later, they re-rented the unit, we would get a notice, and we might not be, you know, checking the system, but we would have a record in which we'd be able to say, oh, this person was evicted for owner move-in, and then 2 months later, it was re-rented to somebody else. So that's one way that some jurisdictions get at it without doing a big rent board.
I think there was a question there.
I'm just curious how this policy is going to impact the current lease agreements that are being used to rent housing. Whether it is an addendum to that or will it regulate these agreements. I'm not concerned because I also work for the county with the behavioral health and recovery services. So I work with a population of clients who struggle with mental illness and co-occurring disorders, and they comprise a percentage of the low income and who utilize the affordable housing. So they get evicted simply because of their impairments and disabilities. So how would this impact their rental agreements? And they just
So first of all, there is a, you know, if the board proceeded with it, there would be a fairly lengthy process. You know, they would have to schedule 2 more public hearings after this. Then there would be a notification period. And if we look at the way the mandatory mediation was done, property owners were required to notify their tenants of this change in county policy. So we notified all of the property owners and asked them to notify their tenants. And it wouldn't change your actual lease. It would just be kind of an overall policy that would affect renters and landlords through Albion Incorporated, part of the county. So if the board adopted it, let's say it went into effect February of next year, that any eviction after that period would need to follow the whatever rules were established in a just cause for eviction ordinance.
okay.
I think there's a question there.
Yeah, first of all, does anyone know how to turn the lights
Oh,
on?
yes, you could probably talk about that. And is that the lights right there by the door? Howie can turn the lights on. You can turn the fans on too, if you like. Thanks, Howie.
Yeah, thank you.
So,
Is that too bright back here? I can turn it on.
I think it looks great.
Is it okay?
I know,
Let me see which one I've got. Hold on.
before there was renting control in San Francisco in the 1970s, whenever there was a landlord-tenant issue, the tenant had to take the landlord to court. And generally, they lost. The judge always ruled for the landlord because he was a landowner, he was upstanding. My landlord was a doctor, didn't even have to show up in court. So do you think enforcement has improved since then? And the second part of the question is, how would going to court work for someone who had English as a second language?
Well, I believe that the courts are required to provide translation services.
Well, I'm kind of talking
Is
about
that-
a fear factor too.
No, no,
Not around all the containers.
not for unlawful detainments. So, you know, I think that I didn't know that, so you're not required to provide language services. I think that it would be imperfect. It's not going to solve all of those problems, but I do think that it, in general, would provide folks with more of a sense of stability. Like, I think that that's the intent of the just cause for eviction ordinance. And folks who are undocumented, I know there's a lot of fear recently with folks who are undocumented that if there was that if all folks were covered by an ordinance like this, that there would be increased security for them too. If you want to add something.
So it's my understanding that sometimes the confusion going into eviction hearings is that sometimes the tenant doesn't even know what they're arguing against, right? So if they don't have a reason that they're aware of they're being evicted, they don't know what to think about and how to prepare going into court.
Right.
So some folks would say that one of the benefits of having the just cause for eviction ordinance is that they understand what the argument is going in and they can be prepared. Now, the burden is still very difficult. They need to be able to prove that, that they didn't act wrongly in this way. They, at least for the just cause ordinance, they would know what they were arguing for or against.
Okay.
And I would think actually, sometimes for landlords, and especially smaller landlords who don't have, a formal lease agreement that we've heard that many of our smaller landlords don't, that it would help them as far as having a clearer path if they needed to give somebody a termination notice for a nuisance, for example, that there would be a clear reason that they would be able to document that also. And so there would be greater transparency both for our property owners and for renters. There's some other.
Yeah, you mentioned it, and I've heard it said at another meeting, but I didn't really understand. You say only in the unincorporated parts of the county. What does that mean?
Right. So Marin has a lot of different towns and cities in it. And then there's a big part of the county which is not in a city, in an incorporated city or town. And so when the Board of Supervisors passes housing policy, for example, it only applies in that unincorporated part of the county. Like here, this is unincorporated. It wouldn't apply in Fairfax or San Rafael or Larkspur. But there are parts of unincorporated, there are some unincorporated areas of Fairfax. There's some unincorporated areas of San Rafael, like out by Santa Venetia, that are unincorporated. Marin City is an unincorporated community, Point Reyes. And so there's both, the whole west part of the county is unincorporated, but there's also little pockets of unincorporated communities, like Novato. There's parts of Novato that are unincorporated.
So it only works in the unincorporated?
It would only apply, if the board passed this, it would only apply in the unincorporated part of the county. And if you look at the source of income protection, that only applies in the unincorporated, except that then Fairfax and Novato have subsequently adopted similar ordinances. And so it applies in those communities also.
But not San Rafael.
Not San Rafael. Not yet. Yes.
I realize you said that rent stabilization is off the table for some reason, but I'm curious to know what the purpose of just cause is if you don't have rent control. Because if you want to evict someone, all you have to do is raise the rent above what your tenant can pay, and you've got yourself a just cause for eviction.
It's true. You can just raise the rent, and there isn't, in just cause, it does not prevent that. That's true.
And that can be punitive.
It could be. There is an option for somebody to go to mediation. We have had kind of a mixed results with the mediation. Sometimes the rent increases have gone ahead despite the mediation. Sometimes they have not gone ahead. In one case, the person got a 2-year lease, so their rent increase stayed the same. They had a 10% rent increase, it stayed the same, but they had a 2-year lease. So effectively, they had a 5% increase per year. And sometimes so I think that if you couple it with the mediation, that those would hopefully be addressed to some extent. but it doesn't address the fact that rents are higher than what a lot of folks would think. You're right.
And out of the 12 people who have used
Mhm.
mediation so far, how many of the results have been tenant friendly?
Yeah, you probably noticed it. You have.
I wouldn't say tenant friendly, I mean necessarily, right? So two parties
In
go,
favor of the tenant.
right.
So, yeah, I think maybe you describe the mediation process, how it works.
Sure, so of the mediations that have occurred, roughly a dozen or so, the question was how many have resulted in some outcome that is favorable to the tenant. So the way the mediation process works, it is essentially requires mandatory participation of two parties if either one of them is party to a rent increase of more than 5% within a year. So it requires that both the landlord or the representative and the tenant or their representative come to the table and have a sincere discussion about the rent increase, and both sides have an opportunity to discuss what the rent increase means to them. Why for the property owner, a lot of times there's really compelling arguments for why they really need to have the increase, and for the tenant, there's a lot of really good opportunity for them to explain to the landlord and the property manager the impact that it has on them, so that everybody is a little bit more aware and they create a more constructive dialogue. Now, coming out of that, I mean, I haven't seen a single mediation. I'm trying to think of how you're defining pro tenant. I haven't seen a single mediation that has resulted in, the elimination of a rent increase. The mediators are not drawing conclusions. It's not arbitration where there's two discussions happening and then the mediator comes out with a statement and it's binding, right? Any agreement that comes out of mediation is voluntary. Both parties agree to it. They're welcome to develop a mediation statement or settlement at that time, but they're not required to. So I would say it's a little subjective. I would actually say that the mediation that occurred in which the tenant still got a 10% rent increase, which is very high, but that tenant walked away with a 2-year lease. That tenant was really interested in gaining more stability. In their statement, they expressed a lot of concern that they were going to continue getting rent increases and that they didn't know if they were going to be able to stay in their home. They were concerned about what was going to happen the next month. So that was a big win for them. I would also say that a lot of times housing services come up in mediations. It's never been used to establish eligibility, but it's also a good way for tenants to say, hey, I understand that you need to increase your rent right now. I've heard your argument. I appreciate seeing these numbers. I appreciate your property taxes have gone up. Gosh, I had no idea. But also, I really miss the garden. Could we, please pay attention to your property, and could you fix the garden up, because I really enjoyed seeing that. So it's a little subjective. We've never had a rent increase go away. The landlords have always had a good reason for the increases.
How many times have the tenants had to move out because of rent increase?
So because we do not collect data on rental units and lease terminations at this time, I can't give you that information. We have had one tenant who may be moving out at some point in the future, but otherwise, we don't have that data without having a data collection provision somewhere.
In the question of mandatory mediation, I've been asked and I didn't know the answer. Is the mediation service provided free of charge to the tenant? And is that incorporate, if the tenant is in an incorporated city as opposed to being in an unincorporated county, does that also apply?
Okay, there's two programs. It's going to get confusing for 1 second. So the District Attorney's Office, the Consumer Protection Unit, has for many years now operated a free service, a free voluntary mediation service to all of the counties, so unincorporated county and all the cities and towns.
It wasn't free to landlords.
Thank you for the clarification. It was free to all tenants, and then it was free to landlords if you just had 3 or 4 properties or less. And that program is very similar to the mandatory mediation program. The key difference is that if a landlord or tenant calls and says, hey, I would like a mediation, the other party could decide whether or not they wanted to have a conversation. So it was voluntary in that sense. The mediation program, the mandatory mediation program, the one that we've been discussing tonight, is a policy, it's an ordinance of the county of Marin, so it's just the unincorporated communities, and it doesn't apply to cities and towns. It's my understanding that the city of San Rafael might consider it in the future, so other jurisdictions are welcome to consider adopting it. We've had some preliminary conversations with the Consumer Protection Unit about expanding the program, but it's really up to those jurisdictions if it's a good fit for them.
But they could then take advantage of the county's district attorney services?
Yes.
So in the definition of just cause, you have this little picture here.
You're pointing to that very cute little house emblem with words in it.
I'm not sure I understand. Just cause does not cover no retaliation, or it does cover no retaliation, or you can't prove that it's retaliation.
So there are, I'm going to back up a little bit. There are already some state protections for tenants, right? So if you complain about a code enforcement issue, the state law says that you cannot be retaliated against for 6 months of time. If you participate in our local level, if you participate in the mandatory mediation program, you are not allowed to be retaliated against for participating in that program. Now, the way that eviction proceedings are currently run, or the eviction process, again, legal aid, feel welcome to jump in.
Legal aid.
Two behind you. The way that they're currently run is that they're typically structured they're really structured to handle non-payment of rent, so they are very quick processes. Was there a question?
Retaliation.
Oh, thank you, sorry. They're very quick processes, I got caught up by you being there. They're very quick processes in which, there's only 5 days of discovery, there's not a lot of time to have a conversation and consider some of those heavier matters. So if the tenant suspects that they've been retaliated against, it's really difficult for them to prove that the reason why they received what's called a no-cause eviction is that it's retaliation. So we're finding we don't have data collection, so all of our data is a little, we get it from certain sources. I've heard from Fair Housing Advocates, Legal Aid of Marin, actually, that half of their eviction cases in the past 3 months has been for no cause. So that's pretty much just when a tenant gets a notice and says that in 30 or 60 days, you need to, your lease is going to be terminated, you need to leave the property. That's a no cause. So in tenants who've experienced that situation, if they think that they've been retaliated against and they don't have a cause for being evicted, it's really difficult for them. Like, first of all, they have to find a way, they have to have 5 days of discovery in which they can prove that the motive behind their no cause eviction was retaliatory. So they have to prove motive and intent, which is very difficult. And then that's the only defense that they have in eviction court. Now, if they had a just cause for eviction ordinance, where the landlord or property manager was required to sort of check a box and say this is the cause, they could then argue against that, if appropriate, in eviction court, and then handle retaliation, if they feel like they're being retaliated against, in a different civil proceeding that has a little bit more time to discuss.
Okay, because my daughter is in the city, in Marin. She had, her husband fell through the decking in front of the front door. It took them 6 months to fix it. They were afraid to report it because generally people who reported stuff get kicked out. The cupboard collapsed after she asked multiple times for them to repair it. Everything was broken. The water came through the ceiling in the living room. And this is a nice building in Nevada. And mold was exposed when the ceiling fell down into the living room. And it wasn't fixed for a long time. And so I had her call the Nevada inspector. The Nevada inspector asked the building owner for permission. The building owner rushed in and fixed things so that the building inspector never found anything.
It's my understanding that under state law, if they notified the building inspector, that they should be protected from retaliation for that for 6 months following that notification.
Even though the building inspector found nothing. He had the building owner make an appointment for him at the convenience of the building owner So the building owner had plenty of time to fix everything. So probably the inspector isn't going to be a good witness for that, right?
Well, I mean, I can't speak for Nevada, and I can't speak to that situation. I'm glad that the house got fixed, absolutely. I would just say that for the state law that says that you can't retaliate for complaints about code enforcement habitability issues, is that if your daughter complained and did issue a formal complaint to code enforcement, that she should be then protected for retaliation just for that purpose
Okay,
for 6 months.
okay.
Now, you can't serial call and complain. I think you can do it like once a year or something like that. But for that instance, you should be protected for about 6 months. However, I'm not a lawyer, and that is not legal.
So the question.
Ask and answer.
So I had a question about the enforcement and if you were able to look at other jurisdictions and what they do about enforcement, because I'm just thinking hypothetically, a landlord, if just cause passed, a landlord could just ignore it and file a 60-day no cause and just file a unique complaint in Marin Superior Court and say I gave a valid 60-day notice, I didn't do this ordinance thing. But under state law, I mean, the court would be required to follow the law and say they gave a valid legal notice. And I think what you said is, then if they got evicted, the tenant would have some other enforcement.
Well, I think that when the tenant went to their unlawful detainer hearing, they could say, they didn't give me a reason, and therefore this is not a just cause under county ordinance, and that therefore that eviction wouldn't be valid.
Okay, I thought that what you said is that it's not something that the state court would enforce.
No,
County ordinance, so they raised the fact that you didn't follow the county ordinance.
No, I mean, the county ordinances are legal in that jurisdiction, so courts have to uphold and address it.
That's what I wanted to.
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's say that I call and complain about some bad conditions. And then I get evicted without cause 3 months later. Is that presumed automatically to be retaliation, or do I still have to prove that in the court?
I don't think that we are really the right people to necessarily answer. Those are probably legal questions that you should ask somebody who knows more, who is an attorney, and ask those. It's my understanding that the burden of proof is on the tenant, but I don't want to be in the position of giving out legal advice with a specific case. Anybody else? I didn't mean to squelch the conversation.
Not legal advice, no advice, it's over.
I understand that data collection is, you haven't said it, but it's a bit of a sore point that we're not doing it. It would be great if we could, and I hope that that will also come up. But do you have a sense, and can you share how big a problem this is in the county?
It's a good question. Why are we talking about just eviction, cause for evictions? Do we have an eviction problem? And I think that what we were trying to show with the data, especially around the data for the tight rental market, is that in a community like ours with a really low vacancy rate, that any unanticipated lease terminations and evictions really have significant impacts on that. I use the example of here, I live here in this community, and we have a really small school district. We have somebody who teaches here, their children go to school here, and they are in a position where they're afraid to report something that was wrong with their house because they're afraid of losing that house and being out of the district, right? And your kids are enrolled in this district. So I think that you have to look at because our rental market is so tight and the vacancy rate is so low, there's not enough choices and options for renters, and that's really why this is a bigger issue. You can look at, and the other thing is that we don't know, right? You can count the number of unlawful detainers that are filed, but most lease terminations are ended before that happens.
So I was on the grand jury last year, and I was on the housing committee, and I think the answer is yes, there is a big issue. And what I heard is that legally is overwhelmed. Yes, okay.
I just want to note that on page 5 of your staff report, there's a survey of renters in the county that, what, is it 45% are concerned with instability of their home?
Right.
Yeah, 59% worried about research.
Excellent use of our staff report.
So in the case of
There and
the
then there, sorry.
teacher, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
In the case of the teacher that you just cited, if the source of income protection, I mean, the just cause eviction were in place, would that teacher be protected?
Depending on the applicability, so that person lives in a single-family home, so it would depend whether it applied to single-family homes or not. But if it did, then yes. Go ahead.
As a landlord, if my tenant finds something wrong with the unit, a roof, a leak in the roof, a handrail that's unstable, a water heater that's leaking, a faucet that isn't working properly, I want to know about it within nanoseconds of it occurring, because I want to take care of my property. My most valuable asset are my tenants, and I hope my tenants' most valuable asset is me as their landlord, because that relationship is very, very important. Anyone who has property in this county that isn't taking care of it is insane.
Right, I think that is true for most people who are property owners in this county. And I think that policies like this are not going to impact most people, but there are a few people that are not, obviously, who are not taking care of their, but I think that most people are in a situation like you are, where they care for their properties, you know, that you're exactly right that you want to know immediately so that before the damage gets worse, before the mold starts or before whatever happens.
Things wear out, things break. That's where they make hardware stores. That's why there's plumbers and electricians and roofers. Let's fix it. Let's stabilize the community. Let's move on.
Right. And I think that it's important to remember that this isn't about villainizing people who are property owners, about landlords, that if we're going to have folks who rent in our community, we need to have people who are landlords and who are property owners, and that it's important to have a dialogue and be able to have that conversation with them. I appreciate that you're here tonight and that we're able to have this.
I'd also like to add that I was born and raised in this county, in Mill Valley. And for the last 45 years, the planning commissions and city councils of the cities and towns of Marin County have actively and aggressively opposed development, building, anything. They have created the weather in which we're all living right now. Okay? So if you want to fix this problem, I have 3 solutions. Build affordable housing, build affordable housing, build affordable housing.
I'm for it. I'm with you.
Okay?
We have some folks right here who are trying to do that here in this community.
Okay. Well, let's get it done.
Yes.
Let's get it done.
Let's talk. All right. Was there a question up here?
Okay.
Comment? Go ahead, Susie.
I just have an advertisement. So this has been really a
Unpaid. It's unpaid.
wonderful conversation. I just want you to know that Kit and I and Hallie and a few other people here are very connected with the San Geronimo Valley Affordable Housing Association. We're an organization that's a brand new startup that started 40 years ago. But we're going to have an affordable housing fair here, right in this room, at the end of October. We're going to be talking about these kinds of things. We're going to be talking about options, shared housing options, JDUs. I invite you all back to come and meet with us so that we can share our thoughts and get to know one another so that we can begin to solve some of these problems together. So we'll be sending out more information about it. And if you'd like to be on our mailing list, please come and see me. I'll be happy to put your name on the list. Because this is such a complex issue, and there's so many different ways that we need to begin to approach this really big, complicated problem. And everything that we can do, we need to be able to do collectively, I think, because with one voice here and another voice there, doesn't have the same impact as though, unless we're able to talk with one another.
Thanks, Suzanne. Alyssa?
Hi, everybody. I manage property, and I want to commend the landlords that are the good landlords, because we have to counsel them. And actually, some of the things that go into place are actually our friends. So having really good inspectors going out the moment there is a complaint actually is my best friend, because I manage 700 properties, a lot of properties. But the best thing that ever happens, especially in the cities and towns, is when they put things in place to do mandatory inspections. And so I'm not the bad guy calling the owner of the property, I'm actually saying it's mandatory. So some of the things we're putting in place, we all have to be in the community, and I have lots of employees that want to live in our community as well. So I think that working together, and we've worked really long, a couple of years, putting people around the table with the really good landlords that really care. And we don't see the bad landlords. They don't come around. But being able to sit at the table and come up with solutions. I went to school, I went to kindergarten right in these buildings. I was raised in Woodacre. So this is my community. I was born and raised here. I've lived here 55 years. But we all have to work together, and we worked really hard to come up with some basis. I don't have to work with legal aid, thank God, because I'm fair to my tenants, and if my clients aren't, we eliminate those clients. So I've been working with our Board of Supervisors and Katie and Damon to come up with programs where we can help things. We haven't had any mediation because we won't do it. So if we set things in place and those are the boundaries, and we all play fair, then you won't see my company going in front of those boundaries, because we're not going to do it. So if we all stand together as a community, we have to start somewhere. Affordable housing is certainly number one, but we got to get people to allow it to be in our community. So I'm all for it, and community and affordable housing, and that's the number one priority, is affordable places for us all to live. So we have to keep pushing through the walls, and hopefully we'll see some success even out here, because it needs to happen. So keep it up.
Thank you. Thanks, Melissa. Anybody else? Last call? Great. Thank you all for being here.
Keep pushing affordable housing.
Just
Right.
one more quick reminder that if you're available
it's called
next
fast
Tuesday
track.
evening, there will be a greater discussion, probably a little bit more robust, in front of the Board of Supervisors at the Civic Center. The meeting will start at 5:30 p.m., so another evening meeting, and you all are encouraged to come, bring your friends, bring your neighbors. If you're not able to make that meeting, but would still have some comments and have some things that you'd like the board to consider, please do either fill out, you can hand write some notes on this piece of paper. There's a cute little box out there that you can submit your comments. We won't look, so we won't know that it was you who wrote them. And you're also welcome to send an email to the Board of Supervisors at bos@laredocounty.org.
Working on my building today.
Thank you all for being
Thank
here.
you.
He is so good.
You are so lucky.